My purpose today is to answer a simple question. The simple question is, why did Brexit happen, and what role did the courts perform in connection with it? So it's a question in two parts, and I'm going to address the question throughout the course of the next hour and a half or so. I want to emphasize that you may or may not agree with what I say, and I welcome any questions or criticisms from the audience. My argument is that Brexit is a product of the inherent defects and deficiencies of the European Union. And instead of blaming populists, the European Union should be blaming itself. That isn't to excuse the populists who have broken the law or have engaged in unfair or unethical practices. Far from it. My argument is that the populists have been used as an easy scapegoat. Whoever the populists are is another issue. The populists have been used as a scapegoat by the European Union to distract attention from the real problem, which is the European Union, the way that it was set up, the way in which it has expanded, and the way in which it is now beginning to disintegrate. And Brexit, the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, may turn out to be a one-off, but it may turn out to be the first of a number of exits that bring about the demise of the European Union. And at the very outset, let me just make the related point that I made this morning before the internet froze. The point is that the exit of the UK from the European Union is the latest in a series of catastrophes to have befallen the European Union. I'll name just three. The first was the financial crisis that gripped the Eurozone members of the European Union a little over 10 years ago. The second was the irregular migration crisis that was prompted in part by the failures that have arisen as a result of years and years and years of appeasement in favor of Turkey. And the third failure has been the failure of the European Union as an entity and its individual members to prevent the pandemic from entering the European Union and spreading across the European Union. That may be partly because of a policy of appeasement in favor of China, as reflected in the Orwellian transformation of the name Wuhan coronavirus, as it was originally called, into the rather anodyne phrase COVID-19. You can see why I'm going to welcome questions and criticisms, because I'm not a diplomat, I'm an academic, and therefore I'm going to speak in a blunt way rather than in a diplomatic way. So before I go any further, Andreas, does anybody in the audience have a question they want to ask? If so, they're welcome to ask it either in writing, in which case Andrea can perhaps forward it to me verbally through the messaging system, or from the auditorium now. Andrea, has anybody got any questions based on what I've just said?
I think everyone is okay here. Does anyone want to ask something before we start? No, Klearchos, we're ready to go. Let me ask you, could you please lower your camera a little bit, because we see kind of half your face. There you go.
That's
perfect.
Okay.
That's perfect, yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
right.
And if anyone has any questions, you can write them in the chat. And I'll be monitoring the chat.
If they write them in the chat, please forward. Can you please read them out to me, because I can't do two things at once here, and I don't want to.
Yes. That's why I'll be monitoring the chat.
Thanks ever so much. Okay, I'll repeat the declaration of interest I made this morning. I'm a British citizen, British born, brought up in the Eurosceptic school of British political thinking, and I've been in the Republic of Cyprus now for almost 6 years. And I'm a permanent resident of the Republic of Cyprus. I lost my EU citizenship upon Brexit, and I'm now in the process of recovering it through an application for Cypriot citizenship that's still pending. Now, what you see on the screen is the legislative history of Brexit and the related treaty relationship associated with Brexit. The United Kingdom did not join the European Economic Community as it then was, in the 1950s. It was, to use an English phrase, a Johnny-come-lately. The United Kingdom didn't join the European Union until the 1st of January 1973, in the absence of a referendum. There was no referendum inviting the British people to vote in favour of joining the then European Economic Community. This is one of the things that's gone wrong in the European Union. Far too many countries have joined the European Union in the absence of a referendum. The Republic of Cyprus had a referendum over the United Nations plan that was rejected, but that plan had nothing directly to do with EU membership. So the Republic of Cyprus joined the European Union in 2004 in the absence of any vote by the citizens of the Republic of Cyprus over whether or not they should or should not join the European Union. We didn't have a referendum when that is to say the UK joined in 1973. We did have a referendum a couple of years later, following the enactment of the Referendum Act 1975. I'll come back to that later. So you can see what's on the screen here is the legislative and legal history of both the accession of the United Kingdom to the European Union and its exit. The point that I want to emphasize here, and this is perhaps where there will be agreement between me as a Eurosceptic and any Europhiles in the audience, is that the process of entry and the process of exit were both conducted according to the law, and more specifically according to the domestic legal and constitutional arrangements in the United Kingdom, and in accordance with the arrangements and the legal arrangements in the European Union. And that is quite right. The law governed the process of accession, and it also governed the process of exit. And that's why what you see on the screen is a mixture of English, which I should say United Kingdom Parliament acts, such as the European Communities Act 1973, that paved the way to accession from the domestic standpoint. And what you also see on the screen are international treaties, such as the Treaty of Accession of 1972 that preceded the European Communities Act. And the international treaties would govern the relationship between the UK and the original EEC, and then later the EU. So where there's no doubt as to where there's no disagreement, I hope, is over the importance of the law as being the vehicle of entering and exiting the European Union. Now that's very important because it goes back to my original title about responsible populism. There were elements of the Eurosceptic movement who were calling for what was originally called a disorderly Brexit, and that became known as thereafter as a no-deal Brexit. I actually campaigned against a no-deal Brexit because I could see the disorderly consequences that would follow a disorderly Brexit. It's rather like leaving a marriage without a divorce agreement. It's not really possible, and therefore that's a point that I want to make clear at the outset. Now, why did Brexit happen? I'm going to boil my answer down to 3 points, and then I'm going to go to a deeper point. So the three main explanations, the three most obvious ones, are political, constitutional, and legal. Those are the immediate reasons why Brexit happened. And then let me just emphasize here, I'm going to then look at some of the underlying historical and cultural reasons why Brexit happened. But let me now just go through these three main reasons. There was a political reason. The political reason was that the United Kingdom government and the United Kingdom Parliament both had the political will to facilitate the Brexit referendum that was held on the 16th of June 2016, and to support the legislation and diplomatic moves that followed. So for Brexit to have actually happened under our constitutional system, there was a need for cooperation between the UK government and the UK Parliament. That led to friction, as we saw for a couple of years when there were difficulties involved in pushing through the relevant legislation through Parliament. But eventually the political will in favour of Brexit prevailed, especially after the general election held in December 2019, and Brexit was facilitated. So that's a very important political reason why Brexit took place. That political reason is tied up with the historical and cultural reasons, which I'll turn to a little bit later on, but I'll just say that for now on the political reason. The constitutional reason is that, unlike almost every country in the world, the United Kingdom does not have a so-called written constitution. It has a an unwritten constitution, an uncodified constitution. There is no single piece of paper or document that is called the UK Constitution, which and there was therefore no constitutional impediment to Brexit. There was no need, for example, to secure separate consent from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. A UK-wide national referendum was held. It was an advisory referendum. It wasn't a binding, it was an advisory referendum. But that was enough to produce the political momentum to press the UK government to activate the process, eventually in tandem with the UK Parliament. Neither the UK government nor the neither the UK government nor the UK Parliament had any constitutional impediment preventing them from achieving Brexit. That's partly to do with the guiding principle of the UK Constitution, which is parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament is sovereign, or at least it was until the United Kingdom joined the European Union, and then there was a surrender of sovereignty in several spheres to the institutions of the European Union. But as we were coming out, there was no constitutional impediment to us leaving, provided the relevant procedures were followed. And we'll see that in one material respect, the relevant procedure was not followed and court action was necessary. That was the second Miller case, and indeed the first Miller case, which I'll look at in a little bit later, that also involved a procedural breach of the Constitution. When I say the Constitution, I'm referring to the bundle of Acts of Parliament and common law rules that make up the peculiar unwritten British Constitution. So that's the constitutional reason why Brexit happened. The legal reason is that just as the UK Parliament enacted the legislation necessary to achieve Brexit, the UK government followed the procedure laid down in the Treaty on European Union. So there was compliance with the domestic law of the United Kingdom. It has to be said with the help of the courts, and we'll look at the two Miller cases in a moment or two, but there was compliance with the domestic law of the United Kingdom, and the UK government adhered to the law laid down by the European Union, for example, in the Treaty on European Union. So those are the three immediate reasons why Brexit took place. There was a political reason, there was a constitutional reason, and there was a legal reason. But there were deeper forces at play. At this point, let me just remind you what Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union says. Any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. So built into the Treaty on European Union is the power of each member state to withdraw from the European Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. And if a member state decides to withdraw, then the procedure needs to be followed as laid down in the second paragraph of Article 50. And it's explicit in Article 52 that there will be an agreement that shall be negotiated in accordance with one of the other articles of one of the other treaties. And that is to say, the agreement shall be concluded on behalf of the Union by the Council, acting by a qualified majority after obtaining the consent of the European Parliament. So there was a procedure laid down for procuring any exit from the European Union, and this was the procedure that was followed for the purposes of European Union law. Let me now turn, before I go any further, does anyone have any questions on the three reasons that I've just sketched out: the political, the constitutional, and the legal? Andreas, if you're there, could you maybe?
Klearchos, I think everyone is clear in the room, and we have nothing in the chat, so you may proceed.
I thank you for that. I'm also doing this to make sure that you're still there and you haven't vanished, because as I've said, I'm speaking into a screen. I'm like a radio presenter. Right, let's look at the deeper forces behind Brexit. I'll just make a general point here. The United Kingdom really does stand out among the well, it did stand out among the 28 member states of the European Union before Brexit, with the exception of France, the Netherlands, Spain, and one or two other countries such as Belgium. Most of the European Union member states were not colonial powers. They didn't have a global empire. They certainly didn't have one as large as the British Empire at its height. This is a map from 1915 during the First World War, which shows the British Empire at its height. The British had just annexed the island of Cyprus in 1914, so Cyprus is in this map. It was previously administered by the British on behalf of the Turks from 1878 until 1914. The British were in occupation of, effectively in occupation of Egypt. They possessed large parts of East and South Africa, or Southern Africa, large parts of the Indian subcontinent, and then all the way down to Australia, New Zealand, and various other colonies, Burma and so on in Southeast Asia. And then on the other side of the world, Canada was a British, effectively part of the British Commonwealth. It was a dominion, and then there were a sprinkling of other colonies in the Caribbean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. So the British, when they were seeing the European Union being created when it was the European Economic Community, were still in possession of large parts of this empire. So when the European Coal and Steel Community was being established in 1951, and then the European Economic Community was being established in 1957, most of this empire was still in existence. The British were still in possession of the whole of the island of Cyprus, for example, in 1951 and 1957. So the British took the view, we don't need to join this European movement. We can stay out. We can control our destiny through our empire. But the empire started to disintegrate in the 50s and the 60s. And by 1973, when the UK joined, the empire was all but gone. There were still a few fragments dotted around the place. And therefore, what I'm going to suggest here is that Brexit is in part, only in part, but Brexit is in part a reaction to the history of the United Kingdom as a former colonial power that had the confidence to say to the European Union, well, look, we've been partners with you for all of these years. Now's the time to bail out. I stress only 52% of those who voted in the referendum voted to come out. So the view that I'm expressing would not have been in the mindset of the 48% who voted to stay in. And even among those who voted to come out, this may not have been in their mind. I'm just putting this forward as a factor, as an underlying factor that may help to explain a Brexit and the mindset of some of those voters. A second very important underlying driver of Brexit is the fact that the United Kingdom did not experience a German invasion or occupation during the First or the Second World War. It didn't experience a Soviet invasion or occupation during or shortly after the Second World War. And as a result of that, there's been this feeling in the United Kingdom over the years that the island of Great Britain is not an island of Europe, OF with a single F, but that Great Britain is an island off Europe, OFF. Now that perception of the island of Great Britain as an island off Europe is partly a product of history, because Great Britain is an island, but it's also a perception that was reinforced by the Second World War, where much of Europe was invaded and occupied by Germany, Italy, or the Soviet Union, and the island of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which collectively formed the United Kingdom, stayed out. I have to stress here that the Channel Islands, which are not part of the UK, but are British Crown dependencies, they were occupied by Germany. But if we leave the Channel Islands to one side, no part of the United Kingdom was occupied by any of the Axis powers during the Second World War. And this helps to distinguish the United Kingdom from some of the other EU member states. Some of those other EU member states were in favour of the European Union and the European project because they regard it, rightly or wrongly, as a mechanism of peace and stability which can help Europe prevent another world war from afflicting the continent. Now that feeling, which is a legitimate feeling, is one that's very pronounced in certain parts of continental Europe. It's much less pronounced in Great Britain and the wider United Kingdom, for the very simple reason that the island of Great Britain and the UK as a whole were not invaded or occupied by Germany during the Second World War. So that's a very important underlying factor. I've already made this point, therefore, that when the Treaty of Paris was concluded, which established the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, and when the Treaty of Rome was concluded, establishing the then European Economic Community in 1957, the UK did not join. The UK stayed out. Instead, it was the countries most affected by the Second World War: France, West Germany, in the then partitioned Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. They were the 6 founding members of the then European Coal and Steel Community that later evolved into the European Economic Community. The UK stayed out. They made a couple of applications to join in the 1960s, and the French president, Charles de Gaulle, said no, famously. My French pronunciation is not very good, but I hope I've conveyed the gist of what President de Gaulle said. He told the British, no, you can't join our club, stay out. That generated feelings of animosity among certain British citizens, but it also whetted the appetite of others, the club. And eventually a Prime Minister by the name of Edward Heath was in office from 1970 until February 1974, and he was a great advocate of the European project. He'd served in the Second World War. He'd seen the horrors of the Second World War. He'd actually, if I recall correctly, even met Adolf Hitler of Germany, and he was very much of the view that the European project was necessary to help establish peace in Europe and maintain peace in Europe. Others disagreed with his approach, but it's a fact of history that it was Edward Heath who was the Prime Minister that took us into the then European Economic Community without a referendum. I want to stress that, without a referendum. And this is the front page of The Guardian on the day that the United Kingdom joined, and I think the headline says it all: we're in, but without the fireworks. The United Kingdom acceded to the then European Economic Community, but there was no universal enthusiasm for the project. There was no national unanimity as to whether this was a good or bad move. A substantial proportion of the population was hostile to the move, but because the then Conservative Prime Minister Edward had a majority in the House of Commons, he was able to push the legislation through Parliament, and it was the United Kingdom joined the European Union. I'm showing you this in order to give you the historical backdrop to the legal developments that we've seen in recent times with Brexit, but I'm also showing you these images to show you that if you want to call it a populist movement, I'm not going to call it that, but if you want to call it a populist movement, you can see that it didn't emerge in the last 3 or 4 years with the Brexit referendum. It's something that is much deeper. It goes back to the 70s and 80s, and indeed to the very day that we joined the then European Economic Community without a referendum. And that gave rise to the perception that there was a lack of legitimacy to this European project. That was eventually rectified with the referendum that was held by the Labour government that came into power in February 1974. They held a referendum in 1975 on the question of whether or not the UK should stay in the then European Community, which was also called the Common Market. You see the image there. That's from the Spectator magazine. That's a magazine on the right of the political spectrum, and you can see there that's the famous statue in Brussels that I've seen, and perhaps some of you have seen. And there was this perception among certain elements of both the right and the left. This is an image from the right. There was a perception back then that Brussels was sprinkling urine all over our national flag and our way of life. and the person who's holding the Union flag is the former Prime Minister Ted Heath, who was the one who took us in during his period in office from 1970 until February 1974. I think it was October 1970 until February 1974 that he was in office. You can also see there behind him are some people on the left of the spectrum, because there were people on the left who were in favour of the European project, there were people on the right who were in favour of the European project, and equally there were people on the left against and people on the right against. This is an important point I want to make. The perception has been created that Brexit is a movement of the political right. To a great extent, or to a considerable extent, it is a project associated with the right. But it is also an idea, Brexit, that many on the left have supported. And that's something that is not as widely understood as it should be. And in the slides that follow, I'm going to make the point that the pro-Brexit movement, or which used to be called the Eurosceptic movement, the Eurosceptic movement embodied substantial elements of both the right and the left. Now, here's a question for you. Is this front page of The Spectator from the 7th of June 1975, forgive me, it's from the week ending 7th of June 1975, that was the week of the referendum. Is that an example of populism? Andreas, do you want to field any views from the audience and convey them to me? Is that an example of populism? Is that image an insult to the Belgians? Or is that witty British humour?
That's first of all, Klearchos, that's a very, very brilliant sketch. I would say a very brilliant cartoon. Wouldn't I like to say something? Because I have something to say here. Klearchos, I think that one of the things that we can bear to distinguish here is, on one hand, Euroscepticism,
yeah,
and on the other hand, the rise of populism.
Yeah.
So, what I mean by this is, you might be right, as you suggest, that the UK has a history of Euroscepticism, right? That's fair enough, right? If we accept your assumptions and your arguments in terms of the historical past, the colonial past, the imperial past, that's fine. We can accept those assumptions, and we can accept that, yes, in the UK we did have a strong Euroscepticism. Incidentally, other countries also had strong Euroscepticism, maybe for different reasons, right? Maybe it wasn't as historically entrenched as in the UK, but other countries also had that. But what I think we can distinguish is this sort of entrenched Euroscepticism, as you described it, and the rise of incendiary populist rhetoric with figureheads like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson and so forth, that kind of exploited the underlying Euroscepticism to a different end, right?
Yeah.
So I do not think that populism necessarily presupposes Euroscepticism, right? I think that populism exploits Euroscepticism when it is there, right? Because within populist rhetoric, it's a very easy step to say, okay, you hate the EU, that's fine. The EU are the elites, we are the ordinary people, so let's go against them.
Yeah. Thank you for those comments, Andreas. Very, very, very interesting. I will mull over them and come back to you maybe at the end of the presentation. But what I will say at this stage is that I just want to reinforce what I said a moment or two ago, that the forces against let me pick up your point about Euroscepticism. Euroscepticism was originally a movement associated with the hostility towards greater European integration, but to a great extent the maintenance of the United Kingdom within the European Union. It was only really through the rise of Nigel Farage and the UK Independence Party, EU elections, but not in national elections. They didn't do very well in general elections, but in European elections, they did very well, and they started because they had a platform in the European Parliament to promote not just Euroscepticism, but to promote the next stage of Euroscepticism, if I can put it in those terms, which is the Brexit movement. So yes, you made a very important point, which I do want to reinforce. There is a distinction to be drawn between what we might call traditional Euroscepticism, which was what I was attracted to as a child growing up. I was born in 1970, so I'm describing my childhood years here. And then later on as a university student. Euroscepticism was very much hostility toward, peaceful, I should say, peaceful and very British hostility, that's to say courteous hostility to the movement towards greater European integration, and certainly antipathy to the Eurozone project in its various incarnations. So that's, Andrea, thanks for those comments. Are there any other comments, or shall I move on? Feel free
yes,
to
no,
make...
you may move on. I mean, I'd just like to say something to your point about Euroscepticism. That,
please do.
I think that Euroscepticism can be quite constructive, right? So even within the EU, you could be a skeptic and work towards improving the EU, reforming the EU, identifying the errors of the EU, right? That's just something that I want to point out, but you may proceed. Yes, you've covered my question.
I'm actually going to come to the point that you've just made a little bit later on, so please jump in and make that comment again when I turn to focus on it a little bit later on. I do like, as my students will know, I do like Socratic dialogues rather than monologues. So Andrea, feel free to comment. Right, this was the result of the 1975 referendum. So the question was, do you think the UK should stay in the European community? Now look at the question, brackets, common market. Back then the impression was created, this is just a common market. We are not voting for a European superstate of one form or another. We're not voting for federalism or quasi-federalism. We're not voting, I wasn't voting back then, I was only 5, but we weren't voting back then over whether to stay in what became the European Union. We were voting whether or not to stay in the European community, which was described in brackets as the common market. A clear majority, 67%, voted yes. They wanted to stay in the then European community. A substantial minority, though, 33% voted no. So here you have a clear majority, there's no doubt about it. 67% is a thumping great majority in political terms, but there's still a substantial minority, 33%, that voted no. And that gave hope to the then Eurosceptic movement, which evolved into the Brexit movement, that there is a formidable minority at the time in favour or against the European project and against UK membership in the European project. And this is what inspired the Eurosceptics on the left and the right to continue their project. And you can see from the front page of The Guardian, which produced this is a newspaper on the left, I should stress, The Guardian announced the results of the 1975 referendum with the headline "Twin Crisis Clouds Euphoria." So there was euphoria in response to what the Guardian called a landslide, but there was still clouds on the horizon, and those clouds became gradually darker as the years went by. And let me now turn to the front page of The Spectator. On the 14th of July 1990, this is when I was an undergraduate, and Euroscepticism was beginning to intensify in the aftermath of Margaret Thatcher's rise to power. Maybe I'll just go to Margaret Thatcher first. Yes, let's just go to Margaret Thatcher first. This is the background to that image that I've just shown you. She was Prime Minister, first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, from 1979 until 1990. She was brought down by a Europhile, Michael Heseltine, who didn't actually replace her. She was replaced by John Major, who was more of a midway figure between Thatcher and Heseltine. He was more of a diplomat. Heseltine, who brought her down, was a Europhile. Margaret Thatcher, by the end of her period in office, was a Eurosceptic. She wasn't a Brexiteer because she was in favour of continued UK membership in the European community, as it was known by the time she left office. But she was really a champion of Euroscepticism. And if you haven't read her speech, or the transcript of her speech in Bruges on the 20th of September 1988, I urge you to do so, because this is the intellectual foundation of modern Euroscepticism in the pre-Brexit epoch. I'll read to you what she said. This is the gist of her argument, and this is the essence of Euroscepticism. I want to see us, that is to say the British, work more closely on the things we can do better than alone. Europe is stronger when we do so, whether it be in trade and defence or in our relations with the rest of the world. So that's a classic Eurosceptic argument. We're in favour of cooperation with our European neighbours. But, here comes the but, working more closely together does not require power to be centralised in Brussels or decisions to be taken by an appointed bureaucracy. So here we have two arguments that we've seen trotted out repeatedly over the years in favour of Brexit and before that in favour of Euroscepticism. The first is that we have seen the erosion of sovereignty in the capitals of each EU member state, and the sovereignty has passed to the institutions of the EU, and there's a centralisation of power in Brussels. That's the perception. Whether it's the reality is not for me to discuss today, but that's the argument that was put forward. And secondly, and critically, decisions are taken by an appointed bureaucracy in the European Commission. There's a lack or a perceived lack of legitimacy on the part of the Commission and some of the other institutions. One can excuse unelected judges. We don't want elected judges that they had in certain parts of the United States of America, for example. So if we leave the judges to one side, my view is there is a legitimate criticism to be made here that there are too many appointed representatives strutting around the stage of the European Union. The classic examples are the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council. You could argue they are indirectly elected by the representative of the people, but I didn't vote for them. You didn't vote for them. These people have reached the top through behind the scenes horse trading as part of the horse trading that goes on in diplomatic centres such as Brussels. Anyway, that was what Margaret Thatcher was saying back in 1988. She added, indeed, it is ironic that just when those countries such as the Soviet Union, which have tried to run everything from the centre, are learning that success depends on dispersing power and decisions away from the centre, there are some in the community who seem to want to move in the opposite direction. This was the time of Gorbachev, who was, in hindsight, dismantling the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed by 1992. And she was making the point here, well, on the one hand, the Soviet Union is beginning to decentralize and dismantle its centralized apparatus of power. And yet the European community is building up its centralized apparatus of power. She added, we have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels. So that was Margaret Thatcher in 1988, and that provides the backdrop to what followed, which was this. In 1990, a gentleman who's portrayed as painting a Hitler-style moustache and hairpiece to the then German Chancellor, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, is Nicholas Ridley, the then Trade and Industry Secretary in the then government of Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher. I should have stressed Margaret Thatcher was Conservative and on the right, very much on the right. He gave an interview, Nicholas Ridley, to the Spectator magazine, in fact to Dominic Lawson, who was the son of Nigel Lawson, who was a cabinet minister of the Thatcher and Major era, the Thatcher era. And this is what Nicholas Ridley said at the time of the proposed what became the Eurozone project, the proposed monetary union. The proposed monetary union is all a German racket designed to take over the whole of Europe. It has to be thwarted. This rushed takeover by the Germans on the worst possible basis, with the French behaving like the poodles to the Germans, is absolutely intolerable. That's what he said. And he went on, and this is what resulted in his resignation. The idea that one says, okay, we'll give this lot, i.e. what he called 17 unelected reject politicians in the Commission, our sovereignty, is unacceptable to me. I'm not against giving up sovereignty in principle, but not to this lot. You might just as well give it to Adolf Hitler, frankly. Comments. Is that an example of populism? Or is it an example of truth-telling? Or is it something else? Andreas, or anybody else?
Would anyone like to say
what do the audience think, Andreas?
Danuta, yes? Yeah, you need to come close because
if they come right to the microphone, I can hear.
So, Klearchos, just a minute, because Danuta here would like to say
I'll ask
something.
the question again. Is this image an example of populism? Is it an example of witty British humour? Is it an example of something else?
No, but it wasn't just a general comment because the issue is here populism and the United Kingdom and the European Union. But I think that the issue was from the just very beginning in the 50s and maybe now the same that for the United Kingdom the first interest lied in the transatlantic relations, and it was in the 50s, and it is now. I think that the United Kingdom wanted to reinstate the transatlantic relations, and it is not as much populism, but another issue, the issue that was at stake in the 50s. And what is another thing is that, as you know, United Kingdom was asked to participate in the negotiations. Europe wanted United Kingdom. European states, and took part in the negotiations that led to the European coal and steel community. Took part, but did not participate, did not become a member, and then took part in negotiations that led to the European Economic Community in the 57, but did not participate because withdrew in 1955. I think that the issue is that the first transatlantic relations, and Europe was the second. The UK interest lied somewhere else, and transatlantic relations prevailed in the 50s, and I think that transatlantic relations, or this desire to reinstate the transatlantic relations, it prevailed here now. In 2016. But I see the original thought or flow as far as United Kingdom is concerned, because United Kingdom could participate in the first communities and could be involved and could have the instruments to shape the European communities. It is the thought on the side of the UK that withdrew from the negotiations, because then the rules were established not by the United Kingdom, but the rules were established by someone else. And now who is to blame? Not European states, but even UK that did not participate, because could participate and could the rules could be more to the liking of the UK than not.
Klearchos, would you like to offer something?
Two comments. Firstly, yes, you're absolutely right. The transatlantic relationship with the United States was certainly a factor behind the thinking of some, particularly on the right, much less so on the left. The other point is that the argument that the Eurosceptics used to put forward is, yes, we need to stay in the European Union and campaign for reform, but that with each passing treaty, whether it was the Maastricht Treaty or the Lisbon Treaty, we could see that, or the Eurosceptics could see that instead of the European Union reforming in a more democratic direction, it was going in what was perceived to be a less democratic and more centralised and more federal direction. So the argument that the UK should stay in the European Union and try and improve it from within was certainly prevalent for a great deal of the pre-Brexit period, but it eventually collapsed. It collapsed really when David Cameron went begging the European Union to reform itself to help him win the referendum, and they decided not to reform, and we ended up with the referendum. So thank you for those comments. I will now go to another really important episode in the history of Brexit, and it's the Up Yours the Law moment. This arose when Jacques Delors was the then president of the European Commission, or as Brexit, Eurosceptics was the unelected president of the European Commission, and he was very much at the forefront of the moves towards establishing a monetary union and a euro currency. It wasn't originally going to be called a euro, but that was the backdrop to this front page of the Sun. The Sun, I have to stress, is the most popular newspaper in England, and you might argue the classic newspaper that symbolizes modern populism. You might equally say this is the newspaper that reflects the thinking of real people in the pubs and clubs of the United Kingdom. But this was the front page that hence turned the tide against the European Union, because the European Union, instead of being seen as a part of the constitutional and legal and democratic fabric of the United Kingdom, was seen, especially after this moment, as a foreign entity that was full of unelected bureaucrats such as Jacques Delors, that was waging a campaign that was contrary to British interests and needed to be taught a lesson. And the Sun thought that the way to teach the European Union a lesson was to invite millions of people to hurl insults and to stick two fingers, which is a very rude thing in British terms, very un-British, very impact. And quote the Sun, this is what they said on the 1st of November 1990. I remember this. I was a second-year undergraduate. This was big story at the time. At the stroke of noon tomorrow, that's to say on the 2nd of November 1990, we invite all true blue Brits to face France, which is where Jacques Delors was from, and yell, "Up yours, Delors!" The ear-bashing from our millions of readers will wake the EC president up to the fact that he will never run our country. His bid to replace the pound with the faceless ecu, which was the then proposed currency, is the last straw. So, Andrea, can you ask the audience on my behalf, is this an example of populism or witty British humour?
I do appreciate your attempt to kind of blur the lines between the two. And I do get it, right? I do see how one could downplay this as just a humorous example from, I don't want to comment on the quality of the Sun. Those of us in the UK know about the Sun, and those from Liverpool know about the Sun even better, but not correct. To digress. Yes, I do see how this could be read as moving from this more Eurosceptic viewpoint to the populist viewpoint, where the EU, and in this case, the president of the Commission, is essentially portrayed as the enemy, right?
Correct.
And therefore, we start, indeed, we begin to have this this distinction between the people, the British people, in this case, it's the readers of the Sun, incidentally, against the faceless, the bureaucrat, those who want to exploit, those who want to run our country, right?
Yeah. My view, Andrea, is this crossed the line. I wouldn't want it to have been censored, but I found this distasteful at the time. I particularly didn't like the insults that were thrown at the French and the language that was used. This was going too far. This is what I would call irresponsible populism. I'm all in favor of responsible populism. Where the line is drawn, of course, is a matter for debate and discussion. But the point is, here, in my view, as a Eurosceptic, this crossed the line. Does anybody have any views they want to put forward?
Wouldn't I like
I'm very
to
conscious it's a workshop,
else?
so I want this to be as interactive as reasonably possible.
Danuta says that the picture of the Lord reminds her of Gorbachev.
What is this thing on
Yeah, so people are wondering what this thing on Delors' forehead is.
His forehead. I think that's the clock. That's the time when we were invited to stick 2 fingers up at him. It's the clock. It's the 2 hands of the clock.
Okay.
I should have warned Stephanie to look away from the screen because the insults hurled at the French. I mean, for me, let me just go back to my point. This is an example. This is very un-British in one sense. I mean, I'm all in favour of British humour and wit, which can be quite caustic, and I would certainly not want to censor this. But I mean, I took the view at the time, and I do today. This was ungentlemanly, if I can use that phrase, politically incorrect. It was certainly it crossed the line from what was proper into what was improper. But it was a telling moment in the history of Euroscepticism, because what it did is it marshaled the forces of the readers of the Sun to the Eurosceptic cause. And many of those readers of the Sun are Labour, or were Labour voters. They weren't all right-wing conservatives. They were, many of them, left-wing or centre left-wing Labour voters. So if you're going to understand Brexit, I go back to what I said at the beginning. The political, constitutional, and legal reasons are really, really important. But if you want to understand the forces that drove or led to the Brexit movement, you have to go back to some of these episodes that I'm highlighting here. I can't go through all of them, obviously, but these are really, really key moments in terms of the switch from Euroscepticism to Brexiteerism. Now, I want to make a really key point. I'm not a left-wing person, but I've always been impressed with the arguments that were put forward by some on the left against the European Union. These were much more measured and persuasive arguments. And I was always brought up to listen to people, irrespective of whether I was ideologically or politically aligned to them. And Chris Mullin was on the left of the Labour Party, a socialist. Now, he believes in certain things that I don't believe in. But when it came to the Eurosceptic movement, I agreed with him. He was a Eurosceptic, but he put forward more arguments rooted in reason. Again, here at 1991, I was a master's student by now, and I was listening to people. I was listening to what the Sun and some of those on the right were saying, and I found those a little bit uncomfortable because they were straying into xenophobic and unpleasant nationalistic areas. I was, even though I was not a socialist, I was persuaded by what people like Chris Mullin were saying. I'll read to you here what he said in the House of Commons on the 22nd of November 1991. In the referendum held in 1975, I voted against our continued membership of the EC. I believe that as a fundamentally undemocratic institution dedicated founding fathers to the free movement of capital and labour, it would be used to undermine many of the great social gains made in this country in the past 100 years. That's a reflection of why so many on the left were antipathetic to the European project, because they regarded it as a capitalist club that was pushing a capitalist agenda. He went on to say, and you can go into the House of Commons website and find this speech in full. My main criticism of the European community, and it is a large one, is that it is fundamentally undemocratic. Unelected commissioners, supported by an enormous and remote bureaucracy, have arrogated to themselves powers for which they are virtually unaccountable. So this is I suggest to you was persuasive, or was back then a persuasive argument that persuaded many people on both the right and the left to join the Eurosceptic movement, that we had here a faceless bureaucracy consisting of unelected apparatchiks telling us in the UK what to do and what not to do through legal means, through the various legal instruments that were passed on to us through regulations enacted by the UK Parliament. But this was the argument from the left, and it was put most vividly by the mentor of Chris Mullin, Tony Benn. Tony Benn was a cabinet minister in the 1970s under Harold Wilson and then Jim Callaghan. He was on what we might call today the far left. He was but he was also a traditional English patriot. He'd served in the Second World War as a Royal Air Force pilot. He was a principled socialist, and I disagree with a lot of what Tony Benn said, but I always respected his arguments on issues to do with democracy and the European Union. And this is what he said, and these words, he used to repeat them on television. I found them in the House of Commons record, which in England is called Hansard. And this has always stuck on me. He had in mind the then presidents of the European Commission and the Council, but you could apply this to any person in power that you meet. So this is what Tony Benn said, and it struck a chord with me, and I want to bring it to your attention. In the course of my life, Tony Benn said in 2001 now, I've developed 5 little democratic questions, as he put them. If one meets a powerful person, Adolf Hitler, Joe Stalin, Bill Gates, ask them 5 questions. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? If you cannot get rid of the people who govern you, you do not live in a democratic system. And for many people, including me, arguments such as this were the clinching factors that turned us into Eurosceptics. The idea that we could not get rid of the people who were in positions of power in the European Union. We can get rid of our Prime Minister through the general election. We can get rid of our constituency MP through a general election. We can get rid of our local councillor at municipal level through municipal elections, but we can't get rid of these people in positions of power in Brussels. Primarily today, the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission. This, I would suggest, was a fatal defect in the design of the European Union, and it was a factor that persuaded many, many people, including me, to turn against the European Union and the whole European project. Although we, of course, support the rule of law and democracy and fundamental rights and some of the other concepts that are associated with the European Union. But what we don't like, what we Eurosceptics didn't and do not like, is this unelected regime that exists. Now, I know the Europhiles would respond by saying, well, the elected politicians are involved in bringing these people to power. Well, my response to that is a democracy rests on the demos, and we've been shut out. We've been shut out, and we're having to rely on an arguably indirect form of democracy. Anyway, the point I'm making is that was the argument from the left. And this helps to explain why, when the Eurozone project was coming to fruition in the 2000s, when we had a government in power, so a socialist government or quasi-socialist government that mixed socialism with capitalism, we stayed out of the Eurozone. So this is a map of the, that was an image taken on the, published on the 1st of February 2020. So that was actually the day we left the European Union, or the day after we left the European Union. We were never in the Eurozone, so we didn't have to leave the Eurozone. You can see there that not every member of the EU is a member of the Eurozone. We were one of those that were out from the beginning. And both Labour and Conservative governments never came close to taking us in, because they could sense the Euroscepticism of large parts of the British people, and that Euroscepticism had an economic and a monetary dimension which was reflected in this. So, but that's all by way of background to 2015, which was the year of the irregular migration crisis in Europe. It was also 2 or 3 years after the Eurozone crisis had hit Cyprus, and before then Greece and Portugal and Ireland. And by this time, UKIP under Nigel Farage was rampant in European elections, at least. And Euroscepticism was beginning to turn into Brexiteerism, the idea that the UK should no longer stay in the European Union and fight its corner, but actually leave. And in 2015, we had a general election. David Cameron won that election, but he was coming under political pressure from the Eurosceptic and what was then the Brexiteer movement. And what we have here is Article 1.2, which is one of the things that, one of the provisions that aroused the indignation of many Eurosceptics and turned them into Brexiteers. It was Article 1.2. This treaty marks a new stage in the process of creating an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, in which decisions are taken as openly as possible and as closely as possible to the citizen. Well, I mean, that's laughable in one sense, because how many decisions of the European Council are taken openly? They're taken behind closed doors, and then they're plonked on us with those council decisions, I think they call them. They're not. We see our parliament conducted in public. We can't see the European Council conducting its affairs in public. So we don't see the European Commission conducting its affairs in public except at press conferences. And so that, for me and other Eurosceptics, this attempt to be open and transparent and democratic, it was just laughable. But what really irked us in the Eurosceptic movement was the idea of an ever closer union, because this was seen as an assault on sovereignty. And clearly, in certain spheres, there needs to be a voluntary surrender of sovereignty, but there was a perception at the time in the United Kingdom that this was going too far. This is an example of the European Union overreaching itself. And this is all by way of backdrop. This is, by the way, this tendency towards ever closer union, of course, gathered pace after the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. And I think the Lisbon Treaty was quite a key moment in this whole story, because it coincided with the Eurozone crisis and all that followed, and antipathy towards the European Union did gather pace as a consequence of those two factors that emerged at the end of the 2000s. On the one hand, the Lisbon Treaty, on the other hand, the Eurozone crisis. And then we come to David Cameron. And I'm just looking at the clock. How long do I have, Andrea? Is it until I'll try and stop within the next 15 minutes and we can have a discussion. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yes, we have until 4 o'clock. So if you want to go up until 2:30, then leave half an hour for discussion. That'd be perfect. Yes.
Okay, I'll carry on until 2:30 and leave time for discussion. So we come now to this was the speech given by David Cameron on the 10th of November 2015. This was at the time that the EU referendum bill was going through Parliament. It became the European Union Referendum Act, which was the legislative authorization for the referendum that followed on the 16th of June. So David Cameron gave this speech in which he said, almost 3 years ago, I made a speech about Europe. I argued that the EU needed to reform if it was to meet the challenges of the 21st century. So that was a concession that the Eurosceptics were right, that the EU was in desperate need for reform. He added, I argued that Britain's best future lay within a reformed European Union if the necessary changes could be agreed. So that was, of course, his gamble. He was trying to persuade the European Union to come up with certain concessions to the United Kingdom so that David Cameron can go to the people and say, look, I've extracted these concessions, support the European Union. That never happened. And I promised the British people that if I was re-elected as Prime Minister, which he was in 2015, we would have an in-out referendum. He gave that promise to prevent the Conservative voters from running off to UKIP and Nigel Farage. He also promised, he reminded his audience, that the final say on whether our national and economic security is better protected by remaining in the EU or by leaving. That promise is now being honoured. So the legislation was enacted, and the legislation was built around a question that was enshrined in the Act of Parliament. So it was a statutory question. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? So the two key verbs there are remain and leave, hence the Remain campaign, hence the Leave campaign. By now, I was, my personal journey, I was living in the Republic of Cyprus and finding myself having to make a decision as to whether I was going to support the Brexit movement. Having been a Eurosceptic, I ended up supporting Brexit, but not being able to vote because I went to register to vote electronically, and there were 2 stages to voting electronically. You had to first of all register and then actually go through the process of voting. I successfully passed through the first stage of voting, which was the online registration phase. And when it came to the second phase of actually voting, the system crashed on me, rather like this morning when I tried to speak to you and the system crashed. I don't know whether it was my computer or the council or the government computer, but I tried and failed to vote, and therefore, strictly speaking, I abstained in the referendum vote. That means I can claim to be a little bit objective on the question. I mean, my sympathies were clearly with the Brexit movement. I did have profound, and I still have profound reservations as to the process that was adopted and the rushed manner in which the process was pursued because of the Article 50 process. In my view, 2 years wasn't enough. Much more than 2 years was needed. Anyway, that's all water under the bridge. The point is that was the legislation that was the product of David Cameron's politics. And interestingly, that's a photograph I found from the UK government website from his period as Prime Minister. You can see that even though he was in favour of the UK being a member of the EU, he's typical of modern British politicians. He wouldn't want to be seen standing in front of a European Union flag. He's much more comfortable, and was much more comfortable in front of a UK flag, the Union flag. And then we enter the lead up to the referendum, and the lead up to the referendum was dominated by 2 political figures on the right, although there were several on the left who supported Brexit as well. If I remember correctly, George Galloway was one of those on the left. So it wasn't and Kate Hoey, a Labour MP, she was on the left, supported Brexit. So it wasn't a solely right-wing idea, Brexit. There were many on the left who supported it, but the 2 leading figures were Boris Johnson, who was very. I've just been reading a book by Peter Oborne. I don't know if you can see that. It's called The Assault on Truth. Peter Oborne is a right-wing journalist, very distinguished and honourable journalist. And even though he's on the right of the political spectrum, Peter Oborne does not like politicians who don't tell the truth, and he had a go at Tony Blair for not telling the truth over Iraq and wrote a book about that, which I encourage you to read. If you want a very useful introduction to Boris Johnson and his relationship with the truth, I encourage you to read the book, The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump and the Emergence of Moral Barbarism by Peter Oborne. I highly recommend it. Boris Johnson was putting forward certain arguments, some of which were factually questionable. And this was one of the things he didn't have to do, but he does have a strange relationship with the truth. Nigel Farage was, in my view, more principled than Boris Johnson, and you can see he was much more courageous actually, because he came out in favour of Brexit way before Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was waiting to see the way the political winds were blowing. I mean, you can see here the bookmakers were, if those of you who understand bookmaking terminology, the Leave campaign in, when was that? 4th of March 2016 was 9-4 against. So the bookmakers were expecting, sorry, Leave 9-4 against. The bookmakers were expecting the Remain to succeed, that 3-1 on. So if you put one, if you, I won't go into my rusty knowledge of betting terminology. The point is that bookmakers who had money to lose through betting on the result of the referendum heavily expected the Remain campaign to win. And you can see here Nigel Farage putting money on Leave at a time when the bookmakers were not expecting the Leave campaign to succeed, and the Leave campaign eventually did succeed. Here is the official result of the referendum. The referendum was held in the United Kingdom and Gibraltar. The United Kingdom has 2 British overseas territories in Europe. One is in Gibraltar and the other is in the island of Cyprus, in the 2 remnants of the Crown Colony of Cyprus known as the Sovereign Base Areas. The voters in the Sovereign Base Areas one of which is just a few hundred yards from where some of you are sitting, in Bila, though they didn't have a vote in the Brexit referendum. The voters of Gibraltar, the other British overseas territory in Europe, did have a vote. That, for me, was an example of the unfairness of the Brexit process. Subject to that, let me now give you the result. The result was that 46.5 plus one, that one is me, I did manage to register, 46,500,000 plus one people were registered to vote in the referendum, and 33 million, I'll make this simple, 46.5 million people were registered to vote, and 33.5 million votes were cast, representing a turnout of 72%. So of the 72% who voted, 48.1% voted to remain a part of the EU, and 51.9% voted to leave. So it was a narrow victory for the Leave campaign. But in a democracy, sometimes, not always, a bare majority is enough to activate political change. And the 51.9% who voted Leave carried the moral force. They didn't carry the legal force because this was just an advisory referendum, but they carried the moral and the political force that helped to activate all that followed. I want to make a very important point here. There was at the time a great deal of animosity exhibited by some Brexiteers towards some Remainers, and that is an example of irresponsible populism, if you want to use that phrase. Everybody in a democracy is entitled to their view. I happen to have disagreed with the people who voted to remain, but I respect their right to vote, and I respect their right to express the view that they do. And in a democracy, it's essential that one respects the political views that are advanced by people one disagrees with, because that's what democracy hinges upon. And it's also what human rights hinge upon. Human rights are founded on the idea of human dignity. Well, how can you treat somebody with human dignity if you treat them with disrespect because you disagree with them politically? And this was one of the things that went wrong in the aftermath of the referendum, particularly when the politics started becoming involved. And there were obstructions placed in the path of the Brexit process. It resulted in a good deal of unnecessary hostility and in some cases personal aggression towards people of the opposite political persuasion. So when we talk about responsible populism, I would say, and if Brexit is, or the Brexit movement is an example of a populist movement, it's essential that movements of this nature stay not only within the law, but within the boundaries of human dignity and respect for others. And that was missing on the part of some of the Brexiteers, not all, but on the part of some. Now, the referendum result was a humiliation for David Cameron, who promptly resigned. You may remember him resigning outside 10 Downing Street in the presence of his wife, who was in tears. He was replaced as Prime Minister by Theresa May, who was a pro-Remain politician who ended up leading the Brexit campaign. A very honourable politician. I actually rather like Theresa May as Prime Minister for various reasons, but she didn't carry the support of the Brexiteers because they didn't believe that she was one of them, because she'd supported the Remain campaign. So she ended up as Prime Minister, and she faced two political problems. The first political problem was that she had a general election hoping she'd win a thumping great majority, and she didn't. She ended up with a wafer-thin majority with the help of the Northern Irish Unionists. I think it was the Ulster Unionists, the Democratic Unionists. And that meant that she was very, very weak politically as Prime Minister. The second problem that she faced was that a great majority of voters in England and Wales had voted for Brexit, but a majority of voters in Scotland and Ireland had voted against Brexit. And that meant that there were domestic, constitutional and political problems that impeded the path towards Brexit. And this brings me now to the two Miller cases, which I will just summarize for you. And here I would suggest is an example of not only irresponsible populism, but grossly misleading populism. The Miller case was brought about because Theresa May, through her Secretary of State David Davis, wanted to begin the Article 50 process by serving a notice on the President of the European Council without seeking prior authorization from Parliament. When Mrs. Miller, who was the claimant in this case, got wind of that through her legal team, she mounted a judicial review. The argument put forward by Mrs. Miller, who was a pro-Remain voter, one has to say here, but the argument that she put forward was eminently sensible and clearly rooted in the constitutional law of the United Kingdom. Her argument was, because of the European Communities Act 1972 that established a statutory scheme under which the United Kingdom must remain in the European Union, it is not within the power of the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union or for any other Minister of the Crown to begin the withdrawal process under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union without the express permission of Parliament by means of an Act of Parliament. The referendum is not binding, it's advisory, and therefore a new Act of Parliament is necessary if the Brexit process is to be commenced as a matter of European Union law. And that, even people like me at the time who supported Brexit or were sympathetic to Brexit could see the logic in that argument. And the case went to the High Court. There was a distinguished panel of 3 High Court judges, 2 of whom normally sit in the Court of Appeal. One is in fact, all 3 normally sit in the Court of Appeal. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas, the Master of the Rolls, Thomas Etherton, MR, and Lord Justice Sales. They were, for the purposes of this case, brought into the High Court. They sat as a panel of 3, and they reached a decision that the proposed service of the notice on the European Union in the absence of domestic legislation was unlawful, or would be unlawful. And this resulted in this backlash, a rather unpleasant and I would suggest underhand assault on the judiciary with this famous headline, "Enemies of the People." One can disagree with court decisions, but one has to be respectful in disagreeing with court decisions. This, in my view, was crossing the line. So let me ask the audience, is this an example of populism at its worst? Or is this legitimate criticism? Andreas, do you mind just fielding any comments from the audience?
Yeah, would anyone like to comment on this? Or, okay, so let me say a couple of things about this.
Go
because
ahead.
I think this is incidentally something that I'm also going to discuss tomorrow in my workshop.
Okay, so we won't spend too much time on it today if you don't want. That's fine.
Excuse me?
We don't need to spend too much time on it now, but you're...
Oh, no, I won't. I just want to say a couple of things. Because it's one thing to say, as you do, that one might disagree with the decision of a judge or of a court, right? That's perfectly sensible. And it's sensible for someone to say, I disagree with this decision because of this reason and this reason and this reason. The reason why this front page has been, it kind of epitomizes the populist aspect of the Brexit campaign is because what we have here is not a sensible disagreement with the decision of a court, right? It instead is an attack on the judiciary as part of an elite who are against the people, right? So it's kind of the epitome of the populist rhetoric.
Yes, it also, as a consequence of what you've just said, undermining the independence of the judiciary in the sense that not undermining the independence, undermining the public confidence in the judiciary. Without public confidence in the judiciary cannot function effectively. And here we have one of the leading newspapers in the United Kingdom embarking upon this undignified assault upon 3 judges who are doing their job. And in my view, as a Eurosceptic, they did a very good job because they reached the correct decision. There was a pre-existing statutory scheme under the European Communities Act 1972, which determined that the UK must remain in the EU and observe the provisions of EU law. It was absolutely necessary for a legislation to be enacted to authorise the service of the Article 50 notice. Anyway, the case went to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. They were the two parties to the appeal. Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, David Davis, at the bottom. The politician I admire, is a great supporter of civil liberties and always independent-minded, right-wing, well, I wouldn't say right-wing, but certainly conservative member of Parliament. And Gina Miller was the claimant who, and I think she was sort of respondent on the appeal. The court was very, very clear in the second paragraph to remind the audience, which is not just limited to law students and lawyers, but most of the United Kingdom, that this case was not to do with whether or not Brexit was a good idea, because the perception created by the Daily Mail was that out of touch judges were preventing Brexit from happening because they were reflecting their Europhilic views. Nothing could be further from the truth. That was, however, what the Daily Mail was insinuating with this headline. The Supreme Court had to remind the British people, the question before the court concerns the steps which are required as a matter of UK domestic law before the process of leaving the European Union can be initiated. The particular issue is whether a formal notice of withdrawal can lawfully be given by ministers without prior legislation passed in both Houses of Parliament and assented to by Her Majesty the Queen. That was the question before the court. It wasn't whether or not Brexit was a good idea. It wasn't whether or not the referendum result should be honoured. It was to do with the legality of the process that the British government had embarked upon. And you can see here what the judges were trying to do, hold their own independence and their constitutional role. And they reminded the British people through the judgment that some of the most important issues of law which judges have to decide concern questions relating to the constitutional arrangements of the United Kingdom. These proceedings raise such issues. As already indicated, this is not because the United Kingdom's membership of the United Kingdom's membership of the EU. It is because they concern, one, the extent of the minister's power to effect changes, and two, the relationship between the UK government and Parliament on the one hand and the devolved legislatures of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on the other. That's because there was a Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish dimension to the case. So I think what we learn from this is that judges, sometimes when they're issuing judgments, have to be mindful of the general public. Here is a classic example of the judges laying down a judgment and having to be mindful not just of the two parties before the court, but the wider public. They had to remind the wider public what this case was about and what it was not about. And I won't go through every single one of these slides, but the point that the court was making was that we don't have a written constitution as such, and the role of the court is to interpret the law. Let me go through the sequence again. The role of the court is to identify the law, to interpret the law, and to implement the law. That's what the court had to do in this case. And they reached the decision that, as you can see, this is the key slide I want to focus on. In the broadest sense, the role of the judiciary is to uphold and further the rule of law. More particularly, judges impartially identify and apply the law in every case before the courts. That is why and how these proceedings are being decided. The law is made in or under our statutes, they're referring here to the Acts of Parliament, but there are areas where the law has long been laid down and developed by judges themselves, that is the common law. However, it is not open to judges to apply or develop the common law in a way that is inconsistent with the law as laid down in or under statutes, i.e. by Acts of Parliament. And because there was an Act of Parliament at play here, namely the European Communities Act 1972, it was not open to judges to enable the common law powers of the Crown under what's called the royal prerogative to prevail. Statute law, which reflected the will of the people through the elected representatives of the people, had to prevail. Where, as in this case, implementation of a referendum result requires a change in the law of the land, and statute has not provided for that change, the change in the law must be made in the only way in which the UK Constitution permits, namely through parliamentary legislation. So what the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom did here was prevent David Davis as Secretary of State for exiting the EU, and by extension Prime Minister May, from serving the Article 50 notice in the absence of an Act of Parliament authorising the service of the notice. And here we have the service of the notice being effected on the 29th of March 2017, pursuant to Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union, but it was also issued pursuant to the European Union Notification of Withdrawal Act 2017, which was the outcome of the legislation. It was the outcome of the court case. I just want to make one final point. I'll speak for 5 more minutes under there, and then I will wrap up. I will never forget, on the day that the British government lost in the Supreme Court, I'll just go back here, on the day that the Supreme Court issued its judgment declaring that the United Kingdom government's approach was not correct, and therefore the UK government had lost the case, the then Attorney General of the United Kingdom, Geoffrey Wright QC MP, he stood outside the front door of the Supreme Court before the cameras of the world, and he made a declaration to the effect that the British government was disappointed by the outcome of the result, but because the United Kingdom is a democracy under the rule of law, the government will honour the result of the court, and it will respect the result of the court. And that was a very dignified response by the Attorney General, and it stood in contrast to the rather timid response of the then Lord Chancellor, Lynn, was it Truss, I think was her name, who said very little to condemn the criticisms levelled at the judges following the first decision of the High Court, the one that produced the Enemies of the People headline. So let me just emphasise here, the UK government under Theresa May did respect the judgment of the court. Now, that may not have happened in certain other parts of the world, but it was a sign of respect for judicial independence and the rule of law that statement was issued by the then Attorney General. Anyway, the government was able to serve the notice through legal means, and the Brexit process began, and the complexities of Brexit unfolded. And we had a number of other Brexit-related cases. Perhaps the most interesting one was the unsuccessful attempted private prosecution of Boris Johnson for allegedly engaging in the offence of misconduct in public office. The factual basis, or the evidential basis for this unsuccessful attempted prosecution, was the argument that Boris Johnson, I'm reading here from the appeal judgment, which overturned the original attempt to begin the proceedings in Westminster Magistrates Court. On appeal, the High Court held the allegation is that the claimant, i.e. Mr. Johnson, endorsed 2 misleading statements. One was, we send the EU £350 million a week, let's fund our NHS instead. And the other misleading claim was, let's give our NHS the £350 million the EU takes every week. At the time, he was Mayor of London and an MP. The offence, the court held, will only be made out if the manner in which the specific powers or duties of the office are discharged brings the misconduct within its ambit. Consequently, at the time of the alleged misconduct, the individual must be acting not simply whilst a public official. So the court accepted that the allegations made by, or the statements made by Boris Johnson were misleading, but they held that he was not making those statements as Mayor of London or as an MP. He was making them whilst being Mayor or as MP, and therefore the offence of misconduct of public office was not at play. They added, though it's not necessary given our conclusions, we would have also quashed the decision on the basis that the finding that the prosecution was not vexatious was flawed. So this raises the question as to whether the assault on truth by certain politicians is in breach of the criminal law. In this particular case, the High Court held that what Boris Johnson did may have been misleading, but it was not in breach of the criminal law. That's a question that you might want to discuss over the next day or so, as to whether political lying or political misleading should be criminalised. If it doesn't stray into areas such as fraud, if it's just hot air on the campaign stage, that's a matter for discussion. I'm not going to say anything more on it here. There was a second Miller case. I'll just finish on this. There was a second Miller case when the Prime Minister decided at a critical stage in the Brexit process, the Prime Minister by now was Boris Johnson, he wanted to keep Parliament shut, to use the correct expression, prorogued, from the 12th of September until 14th of October. So for a whole month, a critical period in the Brexit process, he wanted Parliament shut. He made a decision to shut Parliament. Legally, what he did was he advised, I think it was the Lord Privy Seal, Mr. Rees-Mogg, to advise the Queen to prorogue Parliament, and that's what happened. So the Prime Minister told, or effectively ordered, the Lord Privy Seal to advise the Queen to shut Parliament. She followed that advice and issued the necessary orders to shut Parliament, and therefore her underlings went along to Parliament and served the necessary papers on the House of Commons and House of Lords authorities, which shut down Parliament for a month. You might think this was preposterous in a democracy, but it happened because the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, wanted it to happen, and he took the necessary steps. Well, Mrs. Miller came in with a second attempt at challenging this. So did Joanna Cherry QC MP, a Scottish Nationalist MP, very distinguished barrister who's in the House of Commons, independent-minded. She's fallen out with Nicola Sturgeon, incidentally. Anyway, she brought a separate case in Scotland. She had two cases, one in England, one in Scotland. The court in England held one way, the court in Scotland held another way. So the two cases were conjoined and brought before the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. And the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom held that the Prime Minister's advice to the Queen to prorogue Parliament for 1 month was unlawful. And the justification that the court gave was that there were two principles of our constitutional law that were engaged. The first was the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, that laws enacted by the Crown in Parliament are the supreme form of law in our system, with which, including the government, must comply. However, the effect which the courts have given to parliamentary sovereignty is not confined to recognising the status of legislation. Time and again, in a series of cases since the 17th century, the courts have protected parliamentary sovereignty from threats posed to it by the use of prerogative powers, which is what Boris Johnson was using here when he advised the Queen to prorogue Parliament. And in doing so, the courts have demonstrated that prerogative powers are limited by the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. And the Supreme Court added, the sovereignty of Parliament would be undermined as the foundational principle of our Constitution if the executive could, through the use of the prerogative, that's to say the common law power of the Queen exercised in practice by the Prime Minister, could prevent Parliament from exercising its legislative authority for as long as it pleased. That, however, would be the position if there was no legal limit upon the power of the Prime Minister and the Queen to prorogue Parliament, subject to certain limited extensions. I mean, this was astonishing that the Prime Minister wanted to shut Parliament for a month in order to keep Parliament away from the Brexit process at a key moment in the Brexit process. The Supreme Court held that went against the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. They also held that it went against the related constitutional principle of parliamentary accountability. And they quoted here, this is how common law operates. The courts cite previous judges in previous judgments. They cited, for example, Lord Bingham, of course, the case of Bob and Manning, the conduct of government by a Prime Minister and Cabinet, collectively responsible and accountable to Parliament, lies at the heart of Westminster democracy. So what Boris Johnson was proposing to do was to keep Parliament shut for a month and therefore to prevent him and his fellow ministers from being accountable to Parliament. And that was unacceptable according to the Supreme Court. And I just want to read to you this before I close. Perhaps this will be the final slide. Let us remind ourselves of the foundations of our Constitution. We live in a representative democracy. The House of Commons exists because the people have elected its members. The government is not directly elected by the people, unlike the position in some other democracies. The government exists because it has the confidence of the House of Commons. It has no democratic legitimacy other than that. This means that it is accountable to the House of Commons and indeed to the House of Lords for its actions, remembering always that the actual task of governing is for the executive and not for Parliament or the courts. The first question is whether the Prime Minister's action had the effect of frustrating or preventing the constitutional role of Parliament in holding the government to account. The answer is that, of course, it did. And that's why the court held that the decision to prorogue Parliament was unlawful, and everything else followed from that. So the point I'm going to make here is that the courts facilitated Brexit. Sure, they facilitated Brexit through the two Miller cases. The two Miller cases ensured that Brexit was facilitated in a lawful manner, consistent with the constitutional principles and the statutory law of the land. So Mrs. Miller, even though she was a Europhile and an opponent of Brexit, deserves enormous credit for bringing these two cases. She did not deserve the nasty criticism and insults thrown at her in this internet age where it's so easy to go onto this Twitter system and send messages. She did not deserve that criticism and those insults that were thrown at her. She exercised her democratic right as a citizen to bring these two cases. In my view, she was absolutely right to bring them, and the decisions reached by the courts were absolutely right. My point is, this is how democracy works. Democracy is built around the separation of powers and the citizens. And those three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, have to respect one another, and they have to cooperate with one another where necessary, and they have to respect one another's positions. And equally importantly, in a democracy, every single person has a right to go to court if they have a legitimate reason to go to court. And this is what happened in the Brexit case. So eventually Brexit was achieved and a deal was reached, and there was an EU-UK withdrawal agreement and then an EU-UK free trade agreement, and that was Boris Johnson on Christmas Eve celebrating. That's I've given you some reading from 3 books from the House of Commons Library if you want to read more about Brexit. I won't say very much on responsible populism other than to acknowledge Jamie Fly's article for the Pacific Council on International Policy, who's written a very good analysis of what is meant by responsible populism. So the question is, why did Brexit happen, and what role did the courts perform in connection with it? I hope I've gone some way to answering that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Klearchos. That was very interesting, and thanks for reminding all of us the tumultuous period in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, all the way to the Brexit campaign, and all the politics that were behind all those actions and decisions. All right, so we have about 15 minutes. Would anyone like to ask a question, or is there anything that you'd like to comment?
Criticism. I welcome criticisms as well, Andrea.
Or any criticism to Klearchos' positions. Anyone would like to say something? Stephanie?
No, I think we do have one criticism.
Yes.
Which we had in common.
Yes, so Klearchos, Stephanie and I we're looking at each other. At one point, you mentioned that I think it was Tony Benn.
Yes.
A quote by Tony Benn.
Yeah, maybe put it.
And the last question of that quote was, "Can I get rid of them?"
Yes.
Right? With respect to those exercising political power.
Yes.
The implication of what you were, or the way you put it, indicated that you suggested that the Commission, you cannot get rid of the European Commission, right? And I mean, although it is strictly speaking correct that we don't directly vote for the Commission, it's also true that according to the treaties, the Commission can be removed by the European Parliament. And the European Parliament is, you know, the par excellence democratic body of the European Union. So, at least in theory, and answering Ben's point here, you could say that if you don't like the Commission, and if you don't like the fact that the Commission is what it is, you can vote for representatives in the European Parliament that can dismiss them. Or you could put it another way. You could say, well, if you don't like the Commission as a body, then the European Union is nothing but a union of different member states. So you could take other member states and take them together and say, representing the national will of each of those member states, and say, yeah, let's get rid of the European Commission and let's install a new body where we elect them through Europe-wide elections or something of the sort. I do appreciate the sentiment behind your point, right? That it lacks democratic legitimacy. To some extent, that might be correct, right? But to suggest that it's just, you know, some people over there over whom we have absolutely no control, I think that would be an exaggeration.
Thank you for those comments, Andreas. Yeah, I mean, this is why we have debate and dialogue, to question what other people say and to criticise what other people say. The point that Tony Benn, I suppose, was making, because he was making it in 2001, so back then the European Parliament didn't have as much of a role as it currently has. So maybe it's a product of that epoch. But what I would say is that to those of us used to the British political system, it's much less direct. Going through the European Parliament is much less direct than voting in a general election to get rid of the people who vote for us, who govern us. I think that's the point that he's making. I would make a wider point here. I would make a wider point, and the wider point is this: that the European Union needs to think about the Tony Benn questions, because a way to curry favour is to make the European Union much more and accountable than it currently is. I don't see why there can't be an EU-wide election to vote for the President of the European Commission or the President of the European Council, or both. You could either have it on a purely majoritarian basis, or you could follow the US Electoral College model to ensure that the smaller countries have a slightly inflated role than would otherwise be the case if you just had a purely majoritarian election. But either way, that would be a way of engendering greater public participation in the European Union, and also engendering greater public awareness of the European Union. Another problem with not having elections, I'll put it in a positive, an advantage of having an election and a re-election is that the person who is subject to that election or re-election is mindful of their constituents. In this case, it would be the people of Europe, or the peoples of Europe, to use the phrase in the treaty. Who are the presidents of the European Commission and European Council mindful of? They're mindful of the people who put them in power. Now, this is the problem that the UN Secretary General had. I mean, we've just seen the election or the re-election of the UN Secretary General for a second term. He was elected as president he was elected as UN Secretary General by the member states of the European Union. He's just reaching the end of his first term. He's been re-elected for a second term. So who was he looking to curry favour from? He was looking to curry favour from the governments of the UN, not the people of the world. And this is the thing that the EU needs to think about. Do they want to have this sort of indirect form of democracy that they currently have, or do they want to try and make it a little bit more democratic? My view, if in the best interest of the European Union, they should be thinking more in terms of direct democracy to prevent a second Brexit or from happening in another part of the EU. So yes, thank you for those comments and criticisms. They're well taken, well received. But the fundamental question remains, the perception that these people strutting the European stage lack democratic legitimacy.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Stephanie, would you like to come back on this point, or?
No, I think it's fine.
Okay.
There are more mechanisms to ensure, accountability, but it's fine. I mean,
okay.
He's right about the general picture.
Would anyone else like to comment on anything, either here in class or on Microsoft Teams? Eva has several questions. Okay, good. Let's hear from you. There you go. Or you can come here. Yeah.
Should I speak with my mask on?
No, you can take it off so they can hear you.
Okay.
Just come to the mic. If you come to the microphone,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have several questions. The first one is if England was entered half-heartedly in the then European Economic Community, why did they even join in the first place?
Okay. Answer that.
Emma, do you have more questions if you want to ask a few questions together?
I have several, but it's after he answers them that I continue with the
okay,
rest.
that comeback
Okay,
questions.
let me answer that first one.
Questions.
In 1962, Dean Acheson, who was I think he was US Secretary of State at the time, he made an observation: the United Kingdom had lost an empire but not yet found a role. And the question that arose from 1962 onwards was, what was the role of the United Kingdom in the world? It was no longer the colonial power that it once was. It was no longer a member of the big three during the Second World War, together with the US and the USSR. And it was floundering around for a role in the world. And Edward Heath became leader of the Conservative Party in opposition in 1965. And his great idea as Conservative leader was to press for the United Kingdom to apply to join the European Union. I repeat what I said earlier. He lived through the Second World War. He'd seen the horrors associated with invasions, occupations, acts of genocide, and so on. And he took the view, principled view, I disagree with it, but he took the principled view that the way in which the continent of Europe needed to develop was by having the United Kingdom within the then European Economic Community and helping the then European Economic Community increase its role on the world stage and on the European stage. So Ted Heath, as the then driving force of the Conservative Party and then as Prime Minister from 1970 until 1974, took the view that it was in the national interest of the United Kingdom and in the collective interest of the European Union, the then European Economic Community member states, for the UK to form part of their club to help preserve peace in Europe and to supplement the other existing organizations such as NATO and the Council of Europe. There was a strong economic argument, because we are an island off the continent of Europe. We need our farmers to be able to export fruit and vegetables and milk and all cheese and all the other things. But equally, we need to import goods from Europe, and therefore a close relationship with this then relatively new body was seen as being in the economic and the trading interests of the United Kingdom, and hence the phrase the common market that was prevalent at the time. So looking back at history, there was a justification from the point of view of Edward Heath in pressing for the UK to join. The problem was, I go back to what I was saying in the talk, the problem was he should have had a referendum. If he'd have had a referendum, it would have it would have brought the United Kingdom much more aligned to democracy, and it would have prevented many of the arguments that later emerged that accession was an inherently undemocratic process. I mean, equally, one might say, well, we joined the European Economic Community in a very British way through an Act of Parliament and a negotiation at a European level, which resulted in the Treaty of Accession. I mean, you can argue it both ways, but in hindsight, the decision not to have a referendum in 1972 was damaging to the cause of both the Europhile movement, which Ted Heath was very much a part of. It was also damaging to the European movement across the continent. What was your other question?
My other question is similar to what you just said now regarding about the referendum. It happened after the UK joined the EU.
Can you just come back? Can you come to the microphone and repeat your point?
Yeah. Sorry.
I can hear better now.
My next question, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear very well.
Okay, my second question is relating to what you just mentioned about the referendum that the UK had after it joined the EU. I wanted to ask, how could England claim to be a democratic society and represent the people when they didn't provide a referendum and ask them if they want to join the EU or not? That was the opposite of democratic.
Well, one school of thought might say, well, if they had a referendum in 1972, a majority may have voted no. The fact that the political and constitutional fact is that Edward Heath had a majority of, or had the confidence of the majority of MPs in the House of Commons, and he was able to push through the legislation. And a referendum would have been a gamble. I have to say one other thing. Referenda were not really part of the British constitutional tradition until well after the 1975 referendum. It was only really with Tony Blair coming to power and having referendums over whether to have a Scottish devolution and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, various other. We had a referendum over whether or not to change the voting system. That was all done under Tony Blair. So one of Tony Blair's achievements, if you want to call it an achievement, was to implant the concept of a referendum as part of our constitutional culture. So back in the 70s, the referendum that they held was a very peculiar occurrence. We operate under parliamentary sovereignty, with Parliament taking decisions on behalf of the people. So the 1975 referendum was bucked the trend in one sense, and the absence of a referendum was, there was no need to have a referendum in 1972. My point is they perhaps should have had one, because it would have given accession much more of the appearance of democratic legitimacy. There's no doubt that accession was lawful, both from the standpoint of the then law of the European Economic Community and from the standpoint of the domestic law of the United Kingdom. So it was a lawful accession. The question was whether it was democratically legitimate, which is more of a moral question. So I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you for the answer.
You're welcome.
I have two more questions.
Go ahead.
They're interconnected.
Go ahead.
The first one is when you gave us the examples of the newspaper articles, I think it was The Guardian or other like The Sun, their titles, I would argue, were a bit misleading, in a sense that they were misleading the public by infuriating them, like focusing that making some other person or organization the enemy instead of focusing on the bigger picture. So could we argue that with all this misleading from the newspaper agencies led to the 2015 referendum, which was not focused on people's knowledge and of the economic and legal consequences that would follow from Brexit, but it was focused on people's feelings, such as anger or confusion, or maybe even blaming other organizations, such as the then French president of the European Union.
The Commission.
The Commission, my bad.
Yeah. Well, what we've seen in recent years is a wider phenomenon, which is the proliferation of downright false and or misleading statements. Our politics across the European Union and now across the UK, because we're outside the EU, our politics has been contaminated by misleading statements and lies to all intents and purposes. I'm going to read to you something from this very short book, which I rather like, The Assault on Truth by Peter Oborn. He says this on page 9. If history teaches one lesson, it is this: we cannot enjoy freedom without truth, just as we cannot speak truth without freedom. And if we want to keep our freedoms, we can't let liars and cheats get away with it. This is because the liberal democracy we take for granted depends on a public domain with shared facts and assumptions upon which people of goodwill can agree. Once that public domain is ruined, truth ceases to be a point of communal reference. Instead, it divides us. And this is what's really troubling about the movement that we've seen in the United Kingdom and the United States and parts of the European Union in recent years, that the truth is being treated with complete contempt, and one person's interpretation of reality is presented as factual whereas it's detached from the truth. And the truth is really at the heart of any healthy democracy, as Peter Oborn was implying in his book. And we need to have mechanisms in place to ensure that the truth is in place. Now, David Cameron, as a result of the scandal over phone tapping, instituted a public inquiry under Sir Brian Levison, a judge, who completed his report and recommended that there should be an enhanced version of the Press Complaints Commission. So in the United Kingdom, we now have I forget its exact name, but we have a press commission which can play a role in keeping the truth in the public sphere through newspapers. But for that newspaper commission to do its job properly requires citizens to write to it and to activate the code. It's called the Independent Press Standards Authority. That's the name, IPSO, Independent Press Standards Authority. For that body to keep press standards high requires citizens to make complaints. How many citizens are so engaged as to go through the process of filing a complaint? I did once with The Guardian, because you've got to follow the internal procedure of a newspaper first before you go to the Independent Press Standards Authority. I ended up unsuccessful, but I had a very courteous exchange with the lawyer who was overseeing that process, and I accepted the outcome. I didn't appeal on the matter that I complained about. I've actually exercised that system, and I encourage every one of you, if you want to, if you see something that's wrong in a newspaper, do something about it. Don't just sit back and accept it. Write to the newspaper. If they have a complaints policy, go through the complaints policy. If they have a legal department that oversees it, use that legal department. Be courteous and professional in the way that you deal with it, and if necessary, appeal to any body such as the Independent Press Standards Authority. But the truth is the lifeblood of democracy, and it's also the lifeblood of justice.
So, in the end, if the British citizen did know of the consequences that might have occurred after Brexit, such as now checks for customs, the free movement, which is now abolished. Now they need passports in order to visit other countries. And following the economic crisis that occurred, which was because of Brexit and of COVID-19, and other things that also occurred after the UK left the EU. If British citizens knew of these consequences, would you think that the results of the polls might have been different?
What if?
What if?
The most difficult question to answer. It's a very good question. My view is that most people voted by gut instinct, and their gut instinct told them, let's get out of this thing. And that was a product of some of the factors that I was discussing before, some of which were short-term factors such as the impact of the 2015 irregular migration crisis, or the 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013 financial crisis in the Eurozone. Some of those factors were more deep-rooted, going back to the geographical detachment of the Great Britain from the continent of Europe, and the fact that we were not invaded and occupied by Germany during the war. So I have a feeling that the result would have been, what I would say in answer to your question, is a good question, is that we needed to have a more truthful referendum campaign. There were far too many sloppy statements, misleading statements, and downright untruths uttered during the referendum campaign. How that can be better regulated in the future is a difficult question, something you might want to think about during this summer school, because where I would probably be in agreement with the Europhiles amongst you is over the issue of truth. We must have a truthful political culture, because without the truth you can't have proper decision making, either on the part of citizens or on the part of parliamentarians. If you reach a decision based on falsehoods, you're going to end up in trouble. So one of the questions that Europe is facing and the wider world is facing is, how do we promote the truth or accurate reporting, and how do we deal with inaccurate reporting and untruths? Now, the criminal law has a part to play in, for example, fraud. If you defraud a bank or defraud the tax authorities, there's a way in which the truth can be exposed and the perpetrator of the untruth punished. But in the political sphere, it's much more difficult, because you're straying into the area of free speech, what we call in common law free speech, what human rights law calls freedom of expression. Where do you draw the line? That's the most difficult question to answer in any legal debate.
Thank you very much, Klearchos.
Thank you.
And thank you for your presentation.
And just before I leave, can I just thank all of the other speakers? I'm obviously not there physically, so I'd like to just use my platform to thank all of the organisers, everyone involved in organising the summer school, all of the participants and all of the speakers. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. Thank you.